hated. And one day the professor was like, all right, this weekend we're going to this storytelling festival down in Fort Lauderdale, and everyone has to come. It's mandatory. And my mom was like, oh, great. So she's like, all right. So she brings me. We go down to Fort Lauderdale. We go to the festival. It's at a park, spend the day, taking it in. And at the end of the day, there's everyone gathering in this amphitheater. So we're all sitting there. And there's a facilitator at the front. The facilitator says, all right, so everyone can take a turn coming up, and sort of we'll finish the day with people taking turns telling their own stories. Whoever wants to tell a story, you signal that you want to do that by saying tic-tac. Why tic-tac? I don't know, but tic-tac. So everyone starts sort of, getting up, saying tic-tac, and that signals they want to tell a story. They go to the front. They take turns telling various kinds of narratives. So my mom is sitting there just like, all right, this is almost over, almost over. And then she hears this little squeaky voice next to her go, tic-tac. And, of course, that was me. So she's like, oh, Christ. So it's so densely packed in this amphitheater that I have to be sort of like lifted aloft and like passed down to the front. And so when I get down to the front, I'm on the stage, all 5 years young of me. This is the story that I start to tell. And I would like to give credit for the artwork to the daughter of one Todd Sanders, who is the social media specialist at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. So kudos to his daughter for this lovely artwork. So my story that I began to tell was that one day there was an ant, and the ant was walking on the beach, or hanging out on the beach, as it were. And then suddenly, the ant started to fall into the ocean and sank down, down, down to the bottom of the sea. Whereupon the ant encountered a shark. And the shark said, I'm going to eat you. And the ant said, no, 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 please, please, spare my life, spare my life. If you spare my life, I will tell you a story. And before I could finish, I had to leave it on this cliffhanger because then the skies opened, thunder and lightning, one of those classic South Florida thunderstorms came and broke up the whole thing. So I was never quite able to finish that story, unfortunately. However, that wasn't the end of my storytelling career. I went on, got a journalism degree, Boston University. I worked at the Boston Globe for 3 years in their online newsroom, working on Boston.com. And I've been at Tufts since 2004. Like Tanya said, I'm now the manager of web content strategy there. So the way I like to describe that is that, if there's something that has to do with content at the university, I probably have some role behind it or some fault in it. And just this past spring, I co-founded a blog called Meet Content, which really focuses on improving higher ed web content and the stories that we're trying to tell on the web in higher ed. So I want to talk for a second about my job at Tufts. And I know that we typically don't like to talk about mission statements. It's like, those usually kind of hokey and, those don't really mean a lot. But I actually really like my departmental mission statement, and I want to just sort of share it with you guys. So Web Communications' mission is to use the web and emerging technologies to engage our audience with the Tufts story and to enable our partners across the university to do the same. And I'm actually really proud of this because my team isn't just a bunch of content people or just a bunch of writers sitting around. It's a blended team. We have back-end web developers, we have a front-end web developer, project management, content people, social media, the whole package. And so what we try to do, whether it's writing a news story or whether it's updating Facebook or building our mobile site or working on, developing web templates, throughout all of that, we're trying to infuse the work we do with the Tufts story, with our message, with our brand, with how we want to represent ourselves. Everything that we're creating should tie back to what Tufts is and what Tufts means. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what the idea of a story is and how I look at it for what we're doing at my university. So let's just start by figuring out what are stories. The idea of storytelling, as Christina Halverson put it a little earlier this year, it's a very evocative and powerful word. I feel like sometimes it gets caught up in sort of this magical, fanciful context, like fairy tales and fiction and whatnot. But what I want to try to do is make the idea of storytelling a little more tangible, because I think it's very relevant to the work that we do. So neurotic Jeff Goldblum is here to sort of pose the question of what makes a great story? So I want to put that question to you. I want to hear from you guys. What, in your mind, makes for a great story? Yeah? You and you.
I would say...
Okay. Daniel?
Something I
Mm-hmm. Is there a hand back there? Yep. Oh, good. Yeah. Actual substance, definitely. Yeah. A little humor always works. Yep. A mission statement. Once upon a time, the Department of Mathematics. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? What's that? A narrative arc. We're going to come back to that. So yes, all those are definitely really critical components of what a story is. And you see some of those echoed up here, and this is some other sort of keywords, things that I think apply to a story and things that I've heard other people describe as parts of what makes for a good story. There's actually, believe it or not, an organization called the National Storytelling Network. It's an organization for everything nowadays, including HighEdWeb development. And they put out a definition of what storytelling is. Well, their definition is that storytelling is the interactive art of using words and actions to reveal the elements and images of a story while encouraging the listener's imagination. I think it's a pretty good definition of storytelling and what telling a story does. But when I was researching for this presentation, I kind of found one that I like even more, and I wish I had a more firm attribution for it. I kind of found it on someone's website, and it's not sourced very well, so we'll just call it some random Fortune City site, according to some random Fortune City site. But I liked it so much I had to share it. A story is the graphing of a character's emotional experience from the moment it begins to its logical conclusion. So the idea of a character going through an experience. Someone mentioned resolution earlier. But I want to stop and think about this idea of the character for a second. I feel like often in the stories we grew up with, stories we read in the newspaper, Jerry mentioned the idea of villains. We talked about that as being an element in a story. And I think that often the people in the stories that we read boil down to ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And to me, this is a really core idea around what a story is. And this is something that we're going to come back to. So one more sort of interpretation of what a story is. This book by Daniel Pink called A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. And in that, he puts out this definition of what a story is. Stories are important cognitive events where they encapsulate into one compact package information, knowledge, context, and emotion. And to me, those are the four core things in any of our efforts on the web that we're trying to convey, whether it's in writing or in code. These four things are sort of at the core of that. So let's talk a little bit about why stories really matter. Storytelling was the first social media platform. Sorry, Tom, it's true. Storytelling is the oldest form of communication we have. It predates media. Before you had any sort of channel or forum or platform, you just had the message that people were sharing with each other. And storytelling is an act of community. It's how we share our values and our knowledge, both within our own communities, sort of like we're doing here, and how we communicate to other communities, sort of like in our jobs when we're sort of sharing the messages and the stories around our institutions. And stories draw strength from the number of people who share them. So I think about the concept of virality. Everyone talks about viral videos and how do you make that happen. And really the concept of virality really just boils down to, is this something that people are compelled to share? Is this something that is so powerful that people are compelled to pass it along? So when we're thinking about the stories that we're telling, I think it's important that they're shareable, and whatever functionality or whatever portability you give to them in that function, but also are they share-worthy? Are they stories that are really going to compel you to want to pass them on, to spread that message, to communicate those values and that knowledge? So we'll come back to the idea of share-worthiness as well. So I think about the parable of Lot's wife. People probably know this from the Old Testament. God decided to rain fire and brimstone down upon the wickedness in Sodom and Gomorrah, but Lot's family was to be spared. So God said, take yourself, take your family, flee these cities, don't look back. Of course, Lot's wife looks back. She's turned into a pillar of salt. So this is a common parable that, again, many of us probably know from the Old Testament, but you can find versions of this story in cultures far beyond Judeo-Christian cultures. So to me, that really speaks to the universality of stories, how these sort of common messages and refrains and the types of stories we tell, sort of transcend different cultures and different contexts. I had the good fortune to attend the Staymate SimTech conference in Las Vegas last fall. And one of the keynote speakers there was Dr. Susan Weinschenk, who is author of this really great book called Neuro Web Design, What Makes Them Click. And in this book, she talked a bit about stories, and she talked about how stories are sort of a prism for understanding. Basically, we see ourselves in stories. Stories are how we process the world around us. It's how we make sense of things. What more is that we put ourselves in stories. As Dr. Weinschenk explains in the book, when you encounter a story, whether it's in a newspaper, a book, or someone telling you a story at a party or something, it activates the empathic part of your brain. It triggers empathy. And you insert yourself into the narrative. I mean, I think that we can all understand that a story where you can really put yourself in someone else's shoes is really powerful if you can see yourself in that. And that's something that makes a story particularly powerful. A story can gain power through the relevance that it finds in you, if it's able to trigger that empathy in you. Even abstract shapes around us. I like this term storicize. It was coined by one MIT researcher. We seek ourselves. We find reflections of ourselves in everything around us. Again, because that's just a way that we process the world. We look for stories to make sense of things. We look for stories to make sense of ourselves, even in abstract shapes. There's a really interesting study that some researchers did in 1944, where they basically created a short film that showed three shapes, two triangles, one larger than the other, and a sphere moving about this field, interacting with a rectangle that was partially open at one corner. And so it's all just these shapes moving around, and there's no context given to it. So they took 34 college students, happened to be from Massachusetts, but I think it probably could have been anybody, and they showed them this film and asked the participants to describe what they saw. Again, all they were presented with is, here's this film, what do you see? And all but one of the participants in the study ascribed human motivation and narrative to what they saw. They saw the larger triangle as a bully trying to oppress the woman, and then the two triangles were vying for the woman's affection, and she was running away, and she was trapped in the corner of the rectangle. Those are real human things. These are abstract shapes. But the way that these people made sense of what they saw was to, again, find themselves and their own feelings and contexts in these shapes that they are presented with in order to make sense of it, because that's how we process the world around us in the absence of anything else, is by creating a narrative. This idea of emotion, I think, has been coming up a little bit, and it's because emotions are really the strongest influencers behind all of our behaviors. I think that includes how our different audiences are encountering us on the web. Everyone approaches a situation from an emotional context. So you think about a prospective student, they might be nervous. They might be worried. Can I afford this college? Are the grades to get in? Or maybe they're arrogant. Maybe they think that they have it all figured out and whatnot. An alum could be feeling really proud of their institution, wanting to find a way to facilitate that pride. Or they could be really bitter, and they could be looking for something to, a way to complain, or maybe you have a chance to change their mind because they're coming at it from that particular context. So I think that, again, really speaks to the power of emotions and how they influence stories. I think that in our day-to-day, there's a lot of sort of the weeds of informational noise that surround us. We're just being battered by a million different inputs and noise and content. And it all just gets really, really noisy. What I think stories could do, a good story, is by achieving that emotional connection, by finding that resonance, by activating that empathy. A good story can cut through the noise and make a difference and be heard and influence behaviors, and those behaviors influence actions. There was a study that Yahoo did that the Neiman Journalism Lab reported on, where they analyzed what stories were being liked on Facebook. What were people clicking their little Facebook like button on? And in their reporting, they wrote, the best stories, the most inherently share-worthy stories, are the ones for which it would be almost weird to email them to someone or tweet them or whatever without an introductory wow or whoa or WTF. Wow, whoa, WTF. That's emotion right there. That's what propels you to share something, when you have a reaction, when it triggers something in you that gets you to then share it and react to it. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed a few months ago talking about ways that different colleges are using analytics and statistics to influence the way that they're crafting their web experiences. And one of the examples they gave was from James Madison University, where what they've done is create a shareability index around their news releases. So they're trying to track, like, what's making our releases succeed? What gets shared and viewed the most? What's really influencing that? And what they saw is that the releases with the elements of a news story, drama, a person fighting for what's right, a villain, have scores 4 to 5 times higher on the index they created than a story that maybe just sort of says, here's our new program, or here's this announcement, or here's the details of this news. It's the emotion, it's that really gets people triggered to sort of share it on. And that's influenced the way that they've now creating their content. They're creating more of those stories that trigger those emotions, that have those characteristics of a good news story. In 2008, I interviewed this woman. Her name is Arlene Isaacson. She's a Tufts grad, and she was involved with the Massachusetts Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus. And that organization was involved in the marriage equality fight that Massachusetts went through leading up to 2004 when marriage equality was recognized in Massachusetts. So she had a prominent role in leading this organization and helping facilitate sort of the legal hassle to sort of get that pushed through. So I interviewed her for a story for the Tufts website. And in our old homepage design, it was like the homepage was like one story, one image. Like that was the whole thing. So we decided to run this story sort of like the last week of March, first week of April, which of course is when admissions decisions come out. So one of our most high-profile times on our website, we're running a story about this alum, sort of just taking over the whole homepage. There wasn't entirely a consensus internally about making that decision. Is this what we really want to run with? Is this the story that we want at our most high-profile time of the year, representing what we stand for? But it ran. The day it went up, we got this email sent to our president. This is just sent directly to our president. And I'm going to read the whole thing because it's worth hearing. I'm a sophomore at Tufts, and I just read today's Tufts.edu profile on the woman working with the Massachusetts Gay and Lesbian Council. I wanted to say how proud I am to go to a school that would put an article like that on the main school site without any fuss. My friend's sister visited from another university this weekend, and she mentioned how her school website featured pictures of cheerleaders at a football game, while ours had an article about Ghana and now gay rights. This is why I'm so happy to be here. Thank you. And to me, that speaks to the power of a story that resonates and connects, influencing behaviors and really standing for what you believe in. I think in the favorite parts of our stories, or the parts that mean the most to us, we tend to sort of dog-ear the page. So I wanted to dog-ear a couple pages in this presentation for some of the points that I really thought were worth emphasizing. And the first is this point about empathy. Again, I think we have to think about the emotional context that people are coming to our web experiences from. And it's really our job for the stories that we create to shape them in a way that anticipates and accommodates that emotional context, and when desired, sort of evokes the new emotion that we want them to feel, or can help change their mind or influence their behaviors. This could manifest in a lot of different ways. Think about that nervous, perceptive student who's nervous about being able to afford college. The tone on your financial aid webpage should be reassuring. It should be sort of help them understand this is not so scary. We're here to help you. Let's find a way to make this work. Or also I was thinking about from Susan Ragland's workshop yesterday, talking about the terms that you use on your website should match what people are thinking about. I think that's a kind of empathy as well, where you're saying, okay, this is how you think about, these are the words that you use. Okay, we appreciate that, we understand. We're going to use those words as well so that you can find the information that you're looking for. I think it also plays out with functionality. I mean, people are coming to our website most often to do tasks. And if we have forms with unnecessary fields or applications with too many buttons or clumsy functionality, that's getting in the way of people doing what they need to do. So I think that that's also a kind of empathy. Being like, okay, I know you just want to get this done. My job is to help you do that. So I'm going to make this an easier form. I'm going to make this cleaner functionality. I'm going to do what I can to anticipate the experience to help you achieve your goal. All right, so the structure of a story. I attended Confab, which was the Content Strategy Conference held by Christina Halverson's firm Brain Traffic in Minneapolis this past spring. And Kim Goodwin gave a talk called Storytelling by Design, and she's the author of a book called Designing for the Digital Age, How to Create Human-Centered Products and Services. And she put forth this idea of a scenario, of using scenarios in product development. She defined a scenario as a plausible story about a persona using the future product or service in a specific situation. And that to me means like looking at the whole of the experience. I think that goes from task motivation, like what is motivating me to want to do something? What are my goals here? I want to accomplish something. To task completion. I have found the information. I have submitted the form. I submitted my application. I have completed this task. So that whole of the experience plays out over the course of a scenario, and that's what she was getting at. And as she put it, scenarios have all the key story elements. You have a character, you have a conflict, you have a plot, and ideally, you have a resolution. I was really heartened to see this tweet by Tracy Mueller the other day. She works at the UT Austin McCombs Business School, and she tweeted about how they're writing user stories for their blog redesign. What a user story is, in sort of the agile modeling terminology, is sort of a high-level functional requirement. So, what are people going to be doing with this blog? It could be, students want to find out about activities. Students want to see the insides of dorms. Students want to, find out how to pick their major or something like that. So those are the user stories that inform, developed by those product stakeholders, whether it's the PR manager like Tracy or somebody else, that gets sort of shared with the developers. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's the ultimate story we're trying to tell. Let's have this blog or whatever application we're developing tie back to that. There was a really great article sort of touching on this in UX Magazine a little while back called Why We Need Storytellers at the Heart of Product Development. And I really thought this quote stood out. In a world where consumers are inundated with choices, products that want to be noticed and adopted must be rooted in the why. So again, inundated with choices, that informational noise. There's so many options and choices and option paralysis that we're grappling with. So our products, and that could be our email newsletters, that could be our Twitter account, whatever it is, we have to sort of ask that essential question of why. I think the why plays out both ways, and this is sort of what the article delved into. There's the external why, where it's like, does this really match up with what people need? Is this really something that people are looking for? Does this answer their questions? And then there's also internally. It's sort of sharing, communicating that value internally, like this is why we need to do this. This is why we need to be on Twitter in this way, because people are going to come to us, they accept responses and ask questions and need engagement and whatever. And getting that internal buy-in that helps support and explain the why internally so that everyone's bought into it and it can be a little more sustainable. I think, who's it? You said the narrative arc earlier. So I do want to go into English class for just 1 second and talk about one sort of English classy kind of term relating to storytelling, and that is the idea of a story arc. What a story arc is an extended or continuing storyline in episodic storytelling media. And the purpose is to move a character or situation from one state to another. In other words, to effect change. And that last part to me is really the most critical. To move a character or situation from one state to another in order to effect change. So, pop quiz. Told you we had English class. What does that sound like to you guys? And this is a question for the class. Does this idea of moving a character or situation from one state to another in order to effect change, does that sound like effective content? Does that sound like good user experience? Does that sound like clean usability? Or crisp functionality? What would you say? You guys are good. You guys are good. Yes. The answer is E, all of the above. And interestingly enough, I think that this is also another way to explain the idea of a holistic approach to web development. All of these structures, and probably some more that aren't listed here as well, are needed to carry our character, our user, through the whole of their experience, across that entire story arc, through that whole scenario, through to the resolution. Because that's what they're interested in, and ultimately we should be interested in too, is them getting to that resolution. So again, with the holistic approach, here's our second dog-ear page for the presentation. Think about the holistic approach, is that none of us can do this alone. whatever independent skill set that we have, whether we're the writer or we're the social media expert or we're the developer or we're the web designer, independently, sitting alone without anyone else, we can't do the job. We can't execute that narrative arc. We can't complete that story. We can't resolve for ourselves or for our users, for our community. So ideally, we need to find a way to bring all of our disciplines to bear to sort of achieve this holistic perspective. I say this acknowledging that for a lot of us in higher ed, this is a very, very difficult proposition. I was at the HighEdWeb Rochester last month, and Rachel Rubin, who's the Associate VP for Marketing Communications at Ithaca College, gave the keynote there, and she was talking about the way she structured her team as more of sort of a cross-functional teams. There's more permeability between the different groups and the different disciplines that they have so that they can sort of bring to bear to help achieve those resolutions, to sort of complete that arc. And a lot of us, who here works in would you say work in a cross-functional team, very permeable structure? Anyone here? A couple? Who works in siloed departments where sort of you have to work really hard to sort of work with other people and collaborate across departments? Seems like there's more of you. Yeah. I think that this is gaining traction, at least among us, I think, in conversations I've had with some of you. This idea that we can't do it alone. We can't do it across silos. It's too much. There's too much of a gap between the sort of distance we have to cross. And I think it's going to be incumbent upon us to start talking about this more and thinking about this more and how to make that happen. How having models like that cross-functional model, how can we make the case for that? I think we're going to start having to grapple with this more. I don't have an easy answer for it, but the idea of achieving that resolution, to me, is really critical. And I think that a lot of times the ways that we're structured in our universities aren't really built to accommodate that. So I think this is something we're going to be bumping up against more in the future. So I feel like there's a lot of biblical references in my talk. I really didn't notice that until I was done. And I was like, wow, this is like a very holy keynote. But there you go. So if I did have an answer to this question, my guess would probably be 1,000. And here's why. So in 1949, Joseph Campbell, sort of like one of the most prominent mythologists of our time, wrote this book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And in that book, he posed the idea of the monomyth. And what a monomyth is sort of like a common structure that he said that a lot of the great legends and myths of our time share. And in the book, he detailed a type of story arc that is common among some of those myths called the hero's journey. And the hero's journey has 12 stages. The first stage is that the hero exists in the ordinary world. Then here's a call to adventure. At first refuses the call, meets with a mentor, and whereupon the hero crosses the threshold, encounters tests, allies, and enemies, then approaches the inmost cave, undergoes a great ordeal, achieves a reward, then embarks on the road back, experiences a resurrection, and ultimately returns with the elixir. So in looking at this, it sounds an awful lot to me like an enrollment experience. I don't know about you, but I had to fill up my HighEdWeb bingo. It wouldn't be a HighEdWeb presentation without a Firefly reference. So just thinking about those 12 stages of the hero's journey, I think it is time for some thrilling heroics. So who exactly are our heroes? Who's embarking on this journey? I want to come back to this idea of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I forgot to mention this earlier, that this is a screenshot from one of my favorite movies, The Never-Ending Story, a really good book as well, actually. And in that movie, Bastian here was just an ordinary kid reading a book, but it turns out that he's on the adventure, that he's actually the hero, and the resolution of the story, the crux of it, hangs on something that he needs to do. So again, ordinary people, whether they know it or not, are doing extraordinary things. So who are our heroes? Who are our big damn heroes in this story? It's the people who are all around us. It's the people who are down the hall and across the quad and the next building over. It's a student just figuring out what they want to major in. It's a faculty member who's in the lab doing research, coming in on a Sunday night to run their experiments. It's an alum who's just trying to figure out how to get to reunions so they can connect with their old friends and, relive the days in the dorm. And it's staff members who are out there recruiting students or developing programs that sort of highlight the scholarship and the works of the community at the university. I think that sometimes we forget how important this stuff is. I think we sometimes become inured to it. It's just all around us. But it's really important, and not just to the people who are doing it, and not just to the institution, but to the world. It sounds kind of hokey, but these things matter, because these people are going to go out, and they're going to do something, hopefully something good, but they're going to go do something. They're going to go make a change. They're going to go make a difference, small or large. This is what they're all going to do. And I think we have to stop for a minute and realize that we work in amazing places. Like, this is just Tuesday. This is just any day of the week. This is all happening all the time. And we have a role in helping all this stuff happening, making that all come to fruition. So what is that role? What is that role going to be? Are we King Arthur, or are we Excalibur, right? What's our place in the legend? This is how I think it shakes out. I think we're Excalibur. I think that we are the sword that King Arthur's going to wield to get the job done. We have to help King Arthur, help that hero complete their journey. There's probably some unicorns involved too, because there usually are. But here's another way to look at it also. I think we're the fat hobbit. So the Lord of the Rings, Frodo is tasked with this perilous, he has to go to Mordor, throw the ring in the fire, and he says, "Go back, Sam, I'm going to Mordor alone." And Sam says, "Of course you are. I'm coming with you." And Frodo gets the glory, and he's the lead character and the hero of the story, but he couldn't have done it without Sam. At the very end, and he can't go on, and he can't make it up to that lake of fire, Sam just picks him up and carries him up the friggin' mountain, makes it happen. So think back again to that, all the noise and the weeds around us, and you know what? In The Lord of the Rings, Sam was a gardener. Great. So if Sam is the guy who helps the story get told, Sam is also the gardener who helps just cut through that noise with that story. And helps that story get told, helps Frodo get up the mountain. So how can we be more like Sam, right? There were some really cool tips that were shared in this article. It's actually written by the VP of User Experience at PR Newswire. It was written in the context of thinking of, how the user is sort of the hero of the press release, the reader is the hero. But I think these tips apply more broadly as well. The first rule that he put out, his name is Rod Nicholson, was to know your audience. Second rule, give your audience what they need to achieve their goal. And the third rule is help your audience tell the world about your story. These are ways we could be more like Sam. So again, the user is hero. Here's our third dog-eared page. This is not about us. Our work is not about us. It's about the people that we're helping do amazing stuff all around us. And our job is to support that. And I know it's a little bit wind beneath my wingsy, but I think Bette Midler had something there. So let's turn the lens, though, for 1 second. Let's think about stories and us and the work that we have to do. I actually had a copy of this book, and then I don't know where I put it. Erin Kissane, it's gone. Erin Kissane is a content strategist who works up at Brain Traffic in Minnesota there with Christina Halverson. And she wrote this really great book called The Elements of Content Strategy. So if you guys have heard about content strategy or like, what does that mean? I don't understand. Everyone's talking about it. This is a really good sort of introductory handbook just to think of it. It's like 80 pages. It's a quick read. It's an afternoon. And it gives you a really good sort of interface for understanding what this means and what the different components of it are. So in that book, she says that for anyone who communicates as a profession, stories are the ultimate hack. And it's really true. They can help us get our jobs done. Susan T. Evans is the Director of Creative Services at College William & Mary. And she does a lot of really great blogging for both her own blog and the Case social media blog. So if you want some really cool insights on a lot of different perspectives in higher ed from someone who's a little higher up, I think she's a really good read. And she blogged a few months ago talking about her social media analytics reporting that she has to do to her higher-ups at College William and Mary. And she had, again, more biblical references. I'm not sure what I was thinking with this, but so what she wrote is that this interesting observation that a prophet was not without honor, save in his own country and in his own house. And what that means is that, you can come to a conference like this, or you can speak to someone at another institution, and you can sort of share your perspectives about, here's what's happening on Twitter and what we're doing. They can be like, oh yeah, it's great, oh, I've learned something. But in your own staff meeting or your own department or your own institution, with the insights that you have to share often fall on deaf ears. I think that's something that we've probably experienced at some point. It seems like external validation is always more valuable than your own internal perspective. This is sort of what she was getting at here. But the second point she made was that parables increased understanding. And basically that's the value of having a good story, a good anecdote, to support what your statistics are. So if you're reporting that, hey, guess what? Over the past 3 months, our Twitter followers have grown 15%. Great, that sounds good, I guess. Like, is that a lot? Like, what does that mean? Sounds good, but I don't really understand it. But if you share the anecdote in accompaniment with that of, well, here's something that happened on Twitter. We tweeted about homecoming, then an alum saw it, and she said, well, I wasn't going to go, but I did go, and then she goes, and she tweets back and says, it was amazing, and I found my old roommate, and this is so great. That was all done through Twitter. Then when you're talking about that 15% growth over 3 months, suddenly that has grounding. Because you said, oh, so this is what happens on Twitter. And now we have more followers, and that's good, right? That's good. I'm speaking like the higher up, right? So, oh, yeah, that sounds like a good thing, that now we can have more of these kinds of experiences. We can get our alumni more excited. We can do all this stuff. So, what she has learned is that she brings those charts and graphs when she's doing her reporting up to her VPs or whatever, but accompanying them now are the stories that help ground those statistics in something meaningful, relate those connections. Again, like the parable of Lot. You have that sort of message, that sort of moral or whatever in that story, but by sort of breathing it in the narrative, it can make a stronger impression. And again, let's talk about the idea of the moral of the story. I feel like that's sort of like a common refrain. The moral of the story is do this or don't do that. So a lot of stories we talk about as having morals. I don't really want to think about those in that context. I prefer to think about stories as having purpose. And some people may call this a strategy. I'm not going to call it a strategy, because to me a strategy is, number one, kind of scary. Who here would say that you're working off of a clearly articulated university-wide communication strategy? Wow. I expected at least a couple hands. So strategies, number one, scary because they seem like this giant thing. They're also apparently elusive. Who could say what our strategy is? We don't have one. So I prefer the idea of purpose. I think it's more direct and it's clearer. So let's think about stories as requiring purpose. And with that in mind, I want to talk about branding for a second. So in November of last fall, I don't know, anyone watch HighEd Live out there? HighEd Live, it's a weekly web show hosted by Seth Odell, who's currently out at UCLA. And he talks about different issues in higher ed every week. And last fall, there was a show with Mark Greenfield. He's from the University of Buffalo. And the topic was When the Axeman Cometh. And it was talking about some of these issues that are threatening higher ed, of like, our certain functions going to be outsourced, are we going to be flattened, is bubble going to burst, and how does that impact the work that we do? So this conversation was happening, the show was going on, and in the back channel, we started to have a conversation of the value of stories and what stories mean in the context of, when the Axeman cometh. And I did a little bit of a blog post after this episode, sort of tying back to the conversation that was happening in the back channel. And sort of what some of us were saying was that the role of stories is that they share and communicate our goals and our values as an institution. And we're talking about the threats facing higher ed. What I came around to, what a couple other people did too, is that we have to embrace our role as storytellers, because no one's going to tell our story for us. And this was one sort of comment in that post that people seem to resonate with people. A brand needs good stories, like a website needs good usability. And what that means is that, again, stories are the way we process the world around us. If we're trying to get people to understand us, think about using a website. If you can sort of, move through it easily and get where you want to go, and you don't get lost or hung up or whatever, then that's a good experience. You're getting the information that you need. So what a brand can do, what the stories can do for a brand, rather, is help us navigate that and understand it. And no one's going to do that for us, right? Like, we're not just going to sit back and sort of say, you'll handle it. We're just going to wait over here and see what happens. We have to understand that that is our responsibility, is to tell those stories. And one other thing that I do want to note is that I think the word branding, I kind of use it almost hesitantly. I feel like it's kind of almost jargony at this point. Talk about, what's our branding? What's our brand? And, da-da-da-da-da. And to me, it's almost just a very heavy word. And really, when you talk about brand, it's really just a $5 word for a good story. If a brand is, what your university stands for and, what our messages are, story does the same thing. And I think that you can understand a little bit more. It's like, here's our story. Here's what we're trying to say. Here's what we mean. Here's our purpose. There's a consultancy called The Storytellers, interestingly enough, and they put out some good tips for thinking about the way that storytelling and branding work together. The first is that the employees had to believe and own the story. And I think that involves drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit. I think that you really have to have some stake in what you're selling to really make that an effective sale. And then there's the idea of taking the recipients on a journey. And that goes back to the idea of the story arc, of bringing people through that experience, of taking them to that resolution. And then there's a need to adapt. I think that, if you're telling your story, the core of it should be unchanged. But, you might need to, there's a new technology that arises. How do we shape our story to fit that technology? Or there's a new priority or a crisis comes up. How do we shape our story to, adapt to this new priority, or what we need to sort of change our message in light of this crisis that's come up? So we need to have stories that can adapt. We also have to, again, think about that emotional level. Think about the ways that our stories are going to resonate and connect, because that's going to help get that message across, get that brand across. What complicates all of this now, of course, is that while we have to take an ownership role in telling our stories and not absolving ourselves of that responsibility, we're not the only ones doing it, right? Our audiences are out there tweeting and blogging and making videos and saying things about us and talking about their experiences with us and saying all this stuff, and we can't control it. It's just out there. Jay Rosen is a journalism professor at NYU, and he talks about the idea of the people formerly known as the audience. So when we're talking about this whole storytelling thing, it's no longer a push, right? I think this is something that we all pretty much understand at this point. It's happening both ways. And, sometimes we hear about this adage, I think, like, our brand resides in our audience. Well, doesn't just reside there. They're writing that brand story. They're out there sharing ownership of our brand story in the content they're creating, in the stories that they're telling. So how do we deal with that? How do we think about that? So we can't control it. So how do we sort of just live with it? Who out there is familiar with fan fiction? Some of y'all. So fan fiction is pretty much like, let's say there's a franchise like Firefly or Star Trek or Star Wars or something, and basically people taking from that sort of franchise and writing stories relating to it. So imagine if there was a story, Harry Potter, that's a sort of a franchise, a story franchise. If I write a short story where I talk about Harry Potter going to school at Tufts, It didn't really happen in the movies or the books, but I'm sort of taking that and extending it, and I'm creating a story that sort of ties back to that franchise. There was a book called The Art of Immersion that a guy named Frank Rose wrote, and he did some articles for Wired magazine in the spring, sort of tying back to themes in the book. And one talked about this idea of fan fiction called the Star Wars generation. And one quote from that article read that if you're going to tell stories beyond what you see in the films, the minute they contradict each other, your house falls apart. If you kill off a character and then try to revive him, it's going to be bogus. So what this gets at is the idea of canon. So in fan fiction, there's this concept of canon. And what that really means is that's the elements of that story, of that franchise, that are sacrosanct. So take Star Wars, for instance. Luke and Leia, spoiler, they're actually brother and sister. Okay. Sorry. If you haven't seen the Star Wars, you should probably just leave. But so that's canon in the Star Wars franchise. Luke and Leia are brother and sister. If you write a story about Luke and Leia's romantic getaway, that's creepy, number one. Number two, you violated the canon of that franchise, of that story. So our institutions, think of our institutions as our brands as being canon. And our community who's out there blogging and students and alums, whatever, those are fan fiction writers, right? So are they aware of what the canon is? Are they respecting it? Is that something that's reflected in their versions of our brand stories? And it's not totally on them, like, oh, well, why don't you know who we are? It's on us to sort of make sure that in everything we do, not just communications, but the entire experience of the university, recruitment. Are we recruiting students that tie into what we say we are? And it just sort of, it ripples from there. We can't really be too upset if there's all this content being created that's off-brand. If we don't have it straight, so if we don't have it figured out, no one else is going to have it figured out. So it's on us to ensure the consistency of that canon and the consistency of communicating that canon to our community. And hopefully, when they take their turn to write their version of our brand story, we see that canon reflected. Luke and Leia are just siblings having a delightful time together, and there's no hanky-panky. That's what we want to see. So that's our fourth dog-eared page we've come to, which is this idea of purpose. Stories, the role of stories is to support the goals and values of our institution. And in order to do that, we have to embrace our role as storytellers in advancing and sharing what those goals and values are. And my idea of what a purpose is, it's a structure that lets a story do its job. Like, I can tell a story, but if there's not a clear reason or rationale or purpose or goal behind it, it's just sort of floating around out there. Stories need purposes in order to succeed. I think that idea of canon also ties back into purpose, because you have to be consistent. We have to be consistent as consistent as we can internally with the way that we are aware and that we share and that we execute from our brand canon, and hope that that is also reflected in the versions of our stories that our community is telling. So we have to give that's a purpose as well, is being purposeful and consistent and clear in what we communicate about ourselves. So why do we matter? We talked about why stories matter, but why do we matter? We are surrounded by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and our job is to help them be amazing. That's just what it boils down to. We have the tools to do this. I mean, we've been talking about the tools all day. We have our Facebook pages, we have our web templates, we have our mobile apps, we have our interactive maps, we have all these tools. So we're all set with tools, we got it. But for those tools to work, for them to help advance and tell those stories, it needs a framework to help them succeed. We need to think about empathy, thinking about the emotional context that people are approaching us with on the web, and how do we navigate that, and how do we accommodate for that. It's employing a holistic approach so that, think about that story arc, that resolution. Everyone wants to get to that resolution. Our users want to get there, and we want them to get there, because that means that they're happy, and they've gotten information, they've achieved their goal. So we have to think about using a holistic approach to help ensure that that happens. It's putting the user as hero, because it's not about us. It's about them and them achieving their goals. And that's paramount in everything that we do, is making sure that the user gets theirs. And then there's the idea of purpose as the structure that helps our stories succeed and gives them the legs and the support that they need to do what they need to do and go where they need to go. So when I was a little kid, one of my favorite books was The Lorax by Dr. Seuss. And I don't know if any of you follow Adam Epstein on Twitter. His handle is Epsteta. And this has been in his Twitter bio, this quote, for as long as I've been following him. And I didn't make the connection until recently that it was a quote from The Lorax. And I think it really is relevant here. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And what I think that gets at is the fact that to do this stuff, we really have to care. We just have to care about what we're doing, because number one, it's hard. This is not easy stuff to do. This is easy. This is not. So to really make that happen, we have to care. And we also have to care because, like I said, it's important. There are important things happening around us, and we have a role and helping those things happen, and helping those stories get told, and helping people do what they're trying to do. Think about the ant and the shark. A story could save your life, or at the very least, make a really big difference in someone else's. And I wanted to close by sharing a quote from what is probably my favorite story by J.D. Salinger, Seymour, an introduction. So it's sort of my charge to you. Give me a story that just makes me unreasonably vigilant. Keep me up until 5 a.m. only because all your stars are out, and for no other reason. Thank you. Do I take questions, or I don't know? Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
All right.
Over here.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
What are your thoughts about? See, you know, and I am an analytics guy. What are your thoughts about evaluating your storytelling efforts, and how do you propose, or what are the things that you currently do?
I think that model from James Madison was really interesting, because I think that when you look at analytics, it's a lot of the numbers around, you know, this is what's popular and this is what's happening, but there's a second layer that isn't baked into any sort of tool, and that's just thinking about why things are happening. So I think it's on us to take the numbers, sort of like Susan T. Evans does at William and Mary, and put them in context and look a little deeper and say, well, why is this happening, and why is it meaningful? And also having that inform what you're doing. So, you know, I think that sometimes we're like, oh, people are really reading stories about, you know, our health research. Let's put more stories about health research. But I think there's a deeper way that you can look at it. And looking at beyond hits and looking at sharing. I think that sharing really gets at, and us being so social nowadays and integrating social more into everything that we do, I think thinking about that why people share and what drives them to share is really important. And that requires a little bit deeper thinking than just what an analytics report can give us. So I think that we do some work in putting things in context and looking at it, but I think to really get at what makes content shareable and share-worthy, really, and then tying that back into influencing what we do in the way that we just not the topics that we cover. I'm talking in news context, but just also thinking about you know, how to set up a story. So don't just have your release that says, oh, you know, we announced this program today. Why is it important? Why does it matter to the university? How does it tie back to what the university stands for? And why does it matter to the people who are reading it? So the numbers alone, as most of us probably know, don't tell the whole story, but there's deeper levels that we have to look at about why things get read and why things get shared. Any other thoughts, questions, reactions, hopes, dreams? Okay. Ta-da-da. Thank you.
Okay, I think what we're going to do now is we're going to ask you to bypass the snack table because we're going to have snacks. I'm sure you don't need snacks right now, right? Everybody just ate. Bypass the snack table, take a restroom break while we get set up for the Smackdown. And all the presenters, anybody who presented and wants to participate in the Smackdown, come on down here. Oh, go out this way. See Carrie? If you go this way, you'll avoid the tasty snacks over here. So go here.
Guess it was Jumbo. Awesome.
Me and Mrs. Jones We got a thing going on. We both know that it's wrong, but it's much too strong to let it go now. We meet every day at the same cafe at 6:30, and no one knows she'll be there, holding hands, making all kinds of plans, while the jukebox plays our favorite song. Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones, we got a thing going on. We both know that it's wrong, but it's much too strong to let it go now. We gotta be extra careful that we don't build our hopes up too high, 'cause she's got her own obligations, and so do I. Me and Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Jones. Well, it's time for us to be leaving, and it hurts so much inside.